Hello and greetings, everyone. Welcome back to Introduction to Geography. Today we're going to be looking at the second part of economic geography, and more of what you would consider maybe white collar end of this. And hopefully everyone out there is doing well, healthy, and not getting cabin fever. I certainly miss coming down there and seeing you guys hanging out with you. Hopefully this stuff all turns a corner here very quickly, right? One different wrinkle I'm going to be incorporating from here on out is that I'm not going to have the whiteboard. You guys don't see the whiteboard behind me at that point. Gonna get really old school at that juncture. I'm going to have you just basically copy down what I'm saying at that point, and I'll alert you to when that practice is going to have to be employed. With economic geography, in this section, we are going to be looking at, well, I guess my major objectives here would be to recognize the logic in early economic theory. As you can see this too on your lecture models. Evaluate economic decisions made by corporations, and become aware of the white collar sectors. Some of the major heads up terms for this section would be the least cost theory, right? The least cost theory, that was a theory um, that came about through a guy named Alfred Weber. Right? It looks like Weber there. He's a German, right? So they pronounce their W's a little differently. They're Weber, Alfred Weber. He was a German economist. Least cost theory, again, early economic theory, basically about plant locations. And Weber felt that plant locations were determined by where the raw materials were and where the folks were, right? And the plant location, the optimum plant location, would be some equilibrium point between the raw materials and the market. We'll take a look at that today. Substitutionary theory. Substitutionary theory kind of looks at the least cost theory and says it's a little too cut and dry. It's a little too cut and dry. There were other things that could be done to cut costs, and I will really dwell on this. To Weber, transportation costs were incredibly important. Substitutionary theory basically says that there are other ways to go around that problem. We'll talk about comparative advantage. Comparative advantage specializes, the emphasis is to specialize in one product, especially if you are a small country and you don't have a lot of resources. You kind of look to tap into your greatest strength and specialize in that instead of spreading yourself too thin. Outsourcing, right? We hear a lot about outsourcing. Some of you, or at least one of you, are doing a paper on that. That's basically relocating your modes of production to lower your cost of production, and that sometimes will involve leaving the country, right? Leaving the particular area. And then lastly, a couple of interesting things here with a white collar sector. We're going to take a look at the quaternary sector. And the quaternary sector is kind of an upper scale end of the tertiary sector, right? Tertiary sector, we talked about that last chapter. White collar work and lower level skills of that, not the cast a dim light on any of that. It's all respected work, but for let's just say a barber, right? A barber as compared to someone with technical skills, right? A barber, maybe the lower end of the I'm not trying to pick on barbers. This is the first thing come to my mind right now randomly. Lower end of the tertiary spectrum, and quaternary white collar work, technical skills requiring knowledge and probably higher education is maybe where I'm going there, the delineation. I'm trying to make it in the Keenery sector, top white collar type of work, right? White collar levels, consultants, governmental positions, right? So there you have that. Let's get into the notes here. Let me just set up. I will talk about Alfred Weber right off the bat here. Let me set this up. Here in this section here, we're talking about trade in primary products that constitutes about 1/4 of the world's, pardon me, rapidly expanding international trade flows. And that proportion, however, is much reduced from earlier levels of manufactured goods. And they grow as a share of developing country exports. Now, raw material exports have suffered from price depression and commodity substitution, and resource-dependent countries have strongly protested what they consider harmful perceived trade inequities as a result. Secondary or manufactured and later stages of economic activity are responsible to cultural and economic rather than environmental controls at location. Now, least cost or Weberian analysis explains optimum plant location in commercial economies in terms of minimization of transportation, labor, and agglomeration costs. And I probably failed to mention that. I'm probably remiss in some of the heads up terms. Yes, agglomeration. We talk about agglomeration, we're talking about markets, right? Where the people are. So profit maximization theory recognizes through substitution principle that not one, but several points may be optimal enterprise locations. In fact, before I get into Weber here, turn to page 278, figure 10.3, because I'm going to be dwelling on that momentarily here. So as we start to talk here and look at your lecture model here, optimum plant location in commercial economies. You can take a look at some visuals here, but let's take a look at the fills here. Alfred Weber, the German economist, he analyzed that plant location was determined by transportation costs. As I said earlier, transportation costs were probably what kept Weber up at night. That is, as I say here, where is transportation of raw materials to the factory? Where is transportation of raw materials to the factory the most cost effective? Or where is the agglomeration? $64 way of saying the markets, right? The people, where the folks are. Where activities cluster, as do people, for common advantage. And this is known as the least cost theory. Sometimes referred to as Weberian analysis. Now, some theorists counter that there are a number of variables that will not necessarily follow the same scenario. So they basically feel that Weber's analysis is too cut and dry. And in their substitutionary theory, for example, one could replace labor with capital. Talk about capital in this instance, we're talking about technology, machinery. So you could replace labor with capital, with machinery. Or you can maximize your manufacturing locations, perhaps lower rent would then increase transportation. Now, outsourcing. Talk about outsourcing here. Outsourcing and just-in-time production processes. These types replaced Fordism. Fordism, that was the assembly line production, right? Back in the 1920s, the Model T production with Ford automobiles. Well, outsourcing and just-in-time production processes replaced that and have altered the classical locational assumptions, which leads to the principle of comparative advantage. And that tells us that areas tend to specialize in the production of items for which they have the greatest relative advantage or least relative advantage. Now, in relation to Weberian analysis, look at figure 10.3, 10.3, page 278. And at the bottom, you can see the plain table solution to plant location problems, right? And you can read that the caption on your own there. But the plain table experiment here by Weber shows you where the raw materials are, right? Raw materials are in Minnesota and in East Texas, southern Florida. The markets are up, looks like the New York City area, right? So the optimum, where's the equilibrium point on this table with these weights? And according to Weber, it looks to me like it's definitely in South Carolina. Looks like it's up in the Columbia, South Carolina area, which is kind of immaterial, but you could see where the equilibrium point would be according to his weights, right? And that would be the optimum place to set up plant location. If you take a look over at figure 2.4, another couple of illustrations there and some pictorial examples there of industrial location considerations in the steel industry. And I would encourage you to take a look at those, read the captions. And then on figure 2.6, the spatial margin of profitability. This is interesting here too on page 280. In fact, I might just read this caption here for you auditory learners. This is a really important point here. Figure 2.6 or figure 10.6 on page 280, the spatial margin of profitability. In the diagram there, the zero is the single optimal profit maximization location for setting up a plant, according to Weberian analysis. But location anywhere within the area defined by the intersections of the total cost and total revenue surfaces will permit profitable operation. Some industries will have wide margins. Others will be more spatially constricted. Several entrepreneurs may be able to expand the margins farther than the less able industrialists. Importantly, a satisficing location may be selected by reasonable estimates, even in the absence of the totality of information required for an optimal decision. And as you can see there by that visual, you have your optimum plant location. But as you start to expand out from that zero, you're starting to operate at, less profit maximization. And then you get too far out from the zero, you start to operate, according to this logic, at a loss, right? So the spatial margin of profitability, kind of an arm or tributary of Weberian analysis. So all this tends to relate to things like outsourcing, right? And the principle of comparative advantage, right? The principle of comparative advantage tells us that areas tend to specialize in the production of items for which they have the greatest relative advantage or least relative advantage. So outsourcing comparative advantage arms extensions of cost-saving measures, right, that we saw with Weberian analysis. And you have, along with this, you have transnational corporations with multiple branch operations in countries other than their headquarters nation. Trying to Coca-Cola, headquartered in Atlanta, right? They have operations in all over the globe, and they're active practitioners in this principle, right, of comparative advantage and outsourcing. So along with that comes international trade, a rapidly expanding growing segment of the world's integrated economy. And this is a clear expression of such areal specialization in manufacturing and commodity production. Let's break this down. You have your white space there for your notes, and I'm going to go old school here. Basically, we're having some technological problems be quite candid with you in recording this. For whatever reason, recording the words backwards. So just going to go old school here, and we can handle that. Comparative advantage, your first set here of notes, comparative advantage. When we talk about comparative advantage, we're talking about how areas can maximize the production of materials in which they have a comparative advantage over other areas. So comparative advantage, how areas can maximize the production of materials in which they have a comparative advantage over other areas. Comparative advantage, how areas can maximize the production of materials in which they have a comparative advantage over other areas. And I don't think I'm going to repeat that 3 times anymore, because you guys could stop the tape, right? You guys could stop it and record that, right? So I'm kind of learning here as I go along. I am not a visual learner. I'm not auditory, but kinesthetic. I learn as I do things, and kind of a hyper kinesthetic learner. So forgive me. So the key here, right? The key here to comparative advantage is to specialize and therefore maximize the product over spreading oneself thinner by producing 2 or more products. And this is, like I said, this is important for your smaller countries. And the U.S. has a plethora of natural resources, big labor market, right? Outsourcing. This is when comparative advantage amounts to lower costs in the factors of production. When we talk about factors of production, we're talking about economics terms here. Factors of production are land, labor, capital. All right, and capital, we're talking about technology and even raw materials. So in this event, the factory may relocate from a more expensive domestic site to a cheaper foreign factory for domestic sale. And this tends to erode Weber's theory, which I talked about earlier. So they tend to help developing countries by providing jobs, right, and help developing countries by lowering labor costs. Foreign nations and foreign nationals from Japan and Europe, for instance, will take advantage of U.S. policies and set up shop here in the United States, providing jobs. Figure 10.8 talks about offshoring, right? Offshoring, there's Google, right? Seeking, you don't have to write this down, but you can take a look at figure 10.8. Google seeking lower labor costs, a large proportion of American electronics, right? Small appliance, auto, and garment industries have been moved to these offshore subsidiaries or contractors in places like Asia and Latin America. Now, major manufacturing regions, and I'm just setting up my my last points here. I want to get into some of the higher level service white collar industries. Major manufacturing regions of the world include Eastern Anglo-American, right, Western and Central Europe, Eastern Europe, East Asia, and then countries within the first three regions here, uh, Eastern Anglo-American, Western Central Europe, Eastern Europe, have been increasingly becoming post-industrial as manufacturing losses are importance, placed a lot of importance and prominence in their national economics. East Asia, and as a matter of fact, East Asia, in contrast, is part of a newer stage of world industrialization that involves not only newly industrialized countries elsewhere in Asia, but also their counterparts in other regions of the developing world. So high-tech manufacturing activities become major factors in employment and output in all economies. And they have patterns. They have patterns of locational orientation and advantage different from more traditional industrial enterprises. Lower level tertiary activities provide place utilities for goods and services, and those types of activities are exclusively market oriented. You have to be near folks. Again, I picked on some earlier, well, not picked on, but I used some earlier goods and services activities. And if you think about them, you have to be near people, right? You can't be out in Timbuktu and survive as a barber, right? Some of the ones I'm going to talk about now are not as contingent on location and so forth. And then with their discussion questions later on in this lesson, you'll be kind of playing around with some of those concepts. Now, the quaternary sector, and we're not writing yet, I'm just setting this up here further. The quaternary sector is an advanced form of tertiary activity. It's not spatially tied to resources. It's not spatially tied to environmental factors or as I said, the market. Quaternary and quinary activities, many dependent on electronic communication, data transfer, are now major components of all advanced economies and of growing importance in international trade flows and economic interdependence. Here's our last set of notes for today. A little white space there, a lot of white space as we finish up here. Quaternary skills, right? Let's talk about quaternary skills. And quaternary skills, we're talking here about technical skills that require knowledge, e.g., for example, tasks taken in office buildings, university classrooms, doctor's offices, right, etc. Now, the trend is that it's soon going to replace all your primary employment. And we looked at primary employment last chapter, where folks are extracting stuff right from the earth. And it's going to also probably take from all secondary employment, which we looked at too, where people are refining the primary activities, pottery, to some delicate assembly line. Now, lastly, Keenery employment. Keenery employment consists of top echelon positions such as government officials, the consultant business, right, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the Keenery employment usually finds their employment base in urban centers, near research parks, universities, and medical centers. And they therefore bring the potential to greater numbers of folks leaving the rural areas as a result for the suburbs or someplace near the functional hubs. And the problem with this, last thing I'll say here before I wrap this up, the problem here is, as I said, it consists of a lot of top echelon positions such as government positions, and that's a danger because the fastest growing sector, and many of you guys have taken my government class, have heard me riff on this in depth and a lot. Government sector is the fastest growing sector in the country, right? And the problem with government is they create no wealth. Their existence comes on selling compassion, and that riffing on that is, for the my government classes. Some of you may remember that, though. The selling compassion and reaping the benefit of taxpayer dollars to prop it all up, right? Taxpayer money, right? You got to be careful there. We can't. It's the fastest growing sector, and taxation has with that a lot of regulations and slowing up the economy. As I say all that right now, we are taking a hit with the coronavirus, right? Unfortunately, I saw, this is a side note, I saw surprisingly last week our unemployment's just at 4.4%. That is still better than it was 5 years ago, right? 5, 6, 10 years ago, believe it or not. It's how bad the economy was doing then, and how well it was doing right before Corona hit. But nevertheless, there you have it. Let's just wrap this up here, and we'll talk briefly about where we're heading in the next week here. So we looked at today economic geography and manufacturing services, Alfred Weber, the least cost theory, cost-effective location of factories, right? Determined by your transportation costs. This is all contingent on the transportation of raw materials to the factory and where you're selling it, right? Getting to the markets. Comparative advantage talks about specialization, right? Maximize resources and product against spreading yourself too thin. Then outsourcing, right? Factories take advantage of the lower costs of factors of production. And then your economic sectors. We talked about the primary sectors last time, right? You're harvesting or extracting resources right from the earth. Your secondary or your manufacturing sector, adding value to your primary materials. You're adding form to it, right? You're taking your lumber and then you're making pianos out of them, right? Baseball bats. Then today we talked about the second half of the tertiary sector, right? The service sector. The lower end of that would be, well, we looked at this last time too, right? Your wholesale retail trade. Today, your quaternary sector, your advanced tertiary end. All right, technical skills requiring knowledge in places like office buildings, university classrooms, doctors' offices, right? You get the picture. And in your Keenery sector, top echelon positions, e.g., government positions, consultants, and contingent there on, well, you get a lot of urban employment, right? And the quaternary sector, just kind of backing up to that, a lot of technical skills, advanced technology, not really tied to being around the folks as much, right? So there you have that. Now, you guys are going to be looking at this on a Monday, right? It's Monday as you see this. Tomorrow sometime I'll give you some marching orders on what we're going to be doing. Class time on Wednesday, 3:15 approximately. And I'm probably going to be sending you guys, I'm looking at we've done these before, a reading guide, right? A reading guide with some discussion questions and for participation and attendance points. And then a week from, as you guys look at this, a week from today, we will be quizzing and then moving on to the next chapter. If I'm forgetting any details there, I'll probably figure that out along the way here and keep you guys up to speed on that. In the meantime, if you have any questions whatsoever, and you guys are pretty good at this, get a hold of me. And the only time I'm really incommunicado is on a Sunday. But for the rest of the week, I'm looking a lot and often at the email. So don't be afraid to contact me, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. In the meantime, please, please, please stay disciplined. I think one of the keys to ending all of this, Corona, or at least being able to slow it up where the medical community can get a handle on it, is discipline, risking cabin fever, but maybe shopping once a week at the most, and staying away from folks, right? So, you guys take care, stay well, and I'll be talking to you down the line. So, take care.